According to my calculations, if you listen to GAC's The Next Decade starting at exactly 11:58:48 p.m. on December 31st, the chorus will hit exactly at midnight January 1st. Start the next decade off right. Nintendo's been around for a long time. Over 130 years to be exact. Starting out as a maker of Hanafuda cards, dabbling in such things as vacuum cleaners, toys, food, taxis, love hotels. Don't ask. But we all know Nintendo for what they settled on. Video games. But while their involvement in the medium went as far back as developing for the Magnavox Odyssey in the early 70s, today they're known for such iconic franchises as Zelda, Kirby, and Pokemon. And putting them in a ridiculous crossover where they beat the crap out of each other. But we might not have any of these were it not for the legacy of a certain arcade game from 1981. I am, of course, referring to the one and only Sheriff. Nah, I'm just messing with you, it's Donkey Kong. The original arcade classic Donkey Kong was one of the most important games in Nintendo's history, and the history of gaming as a whole, so it was only a matter of time before I got to talking about this one. It's an icon of its time, and it still maintains a level of popularity to this day. In fact, there was a documentary made about the race for the high score record. So I'm gonna take a look at this game, its history, and its legacy. There's quite a lot to dig into, enough for a whole construction site. So let's start with how the whole thing began. The year was 1981, and despite Nintendo's success in Japanese arcades, they weren't making inroads elsewhere. The latest failed attempt, the otherwise successful Radar Scope, resulted in a lot of unused cabinets. Facing disaster, then-President Hiroshi Yamauchi turned to a young industrial designer and asked if he could make a new game to convert those cabinets. The young man's response was basically, challenge accepted. The designer's name? You might have heard it somewhere or other. What was it? Oh yeah! Shigeru Miyamoto! Originally, Nintendo was trying to obtain a license to make a Popeye arcade game. When that fell through, they decided to make original characters instead that paralleled the popular comic strip characters. Miyamoto had a few ideas, but originally settled on a carpenter, who would later become Jumpman before taking the now legendary name of Mario, after the landlord of NOA's original office, a lady, who would later be named Pauline after the wife of the warehouse manager, and the Big Ape himself. Funny enough, Nintendo would eventually get the rights to make a completely different Popeye game a year later. There are several theories as to how Donkey Kong got his name, but one of the more prominent ones is that Miyamoto saw donkey as synonymous with stubbornness. Sounds about right. The game was test marketed in a couple of Seattle bars, and despite initial reluctance from the managers, early signs were promising to the tune of 120 plays a day for the first week. Thus the call was made, 2,000 Radar Scope cabinets were converted to Donkey Kong cabinets, and the game officially released in full in July of that year. Needless to say, the game was a hit, and launched the careers of its now famous characters. So let's take a look at the game itself and see what made it so special in the early days of gaming. First thing you notice when you slap the start button is that you see the story unfold on screen. This is considered to be the first game to do so. You see Donkey Kong carry the captive lady up the ladders, followed by him stomping across the girders, then the game starts. Donkey Kong is one of the first platforming games and considered the first to allow you to jump. I guess that's why they call the player character Jumpman, am I right? This iconic first level is a climb up several inclined girders and the ladders that connect them. When I talked about Pac-Man, one of the things I brought up was how it was necessary to be able to convey a clear objective through the game itself. The same principle applies in this game. Even with what's going on, you can tell you need to do it at a glance. Mario at the bottom, Pauline at the top screaming, "Help!" and a limitless supply of rolling barrels in between. So what do you do with those barrels? Well, that's what the jump button is for. Also, those hammers come in handy too. With good timing and patience, you'll reach Pauline, only for Donkey Kong to grab her again and climb higher. The next stage has you dealing with fireballs as you try to remove the rivets and the girders to drop the ape to a concussion and reunite with Pauline. But as arcade games do, we go back to the beginning. Only this time, we add another floor. And Smash Bros. Players are probably having war flashbacks right about now. This is the infamous Bouncing Jack floor, and it shows something else about this game. Before Mario began his exercise routine of jumping, he had glass bones. Any drop higher than a platform's height resulted in a trip to the hospital. The third loop added another floor to the tower. This one was filled with conveyor belts, extending ladders, and... pies? Actually, I think those are cement plates. So now let's take a look at other important elements of the game. More specifically, how elements such as the presentation and the sound design work together with the gameplay. The opening scene is accompanied by the ominous music and the thundering stomps and that growl, showing DK's intimidating presence. After you hear the jingle to start each stage, you hear the subtle yet distinct BGM loop, and your walking is accompanied by a sound effect that, while sounding nothing like walking, does show you're doing something. Jumping over a barrel or grabbing a point bonus? You get a happy sound effect that reflects the points you just got. How about that hammer? Once you grab it...
Stop! Hammer time!
You get this energetic little refrain as Mario swings that thing faster than any human should be able to. And breaking a barrel or destroying some other enemy is accompanied by another sound effect that sounds like a space invader being blown up. Third stage has those bouncing jacks, and they come with their own sound effects for conveyance. And in the final stage of each loop, the fireballs turn blue when you grab the hammer. Gee, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? And of course, there's the triumphant jingle when you clear each stage and each loop. And like most games of the day, it just keeps going until you lose, or until the kill screen, with each life lost accompanied by a death sound that gives the feeling of oopsie! It all works together to form the complete package. Sound, presentation, and gameplay. And they all work together to make the game a success. The success caught the eye of many people. Among those people were the console manufacturers at the time. Now, this was before Nintendo revitalized the console market with the NES. The first company to make an offer was Taito, who offered quite a sum for the rights. Nintendo, however, turned them down. Atari was also interested in approaching Nintendo as well, but the one who was the hungriest was Coleco, who was one of Atari's competitors. Coleco obtained the rights for console ports, bundling it with its ColecoVision system, and also making ports for the Atari 2600 and Intellivision. Imagine if it supported the IntelliVoice.
Please, 17,
Go! However, Atari obtained the rights to port the game to computers, such as the Atari 400 and 800. They also made several ports for other computers under the Atari Soft label. Unfortunately, another party saw the success of Donkey Kong and was none too happy about it. That party was Universal Pictures. I wonder why they'd be upset. Giant ape named Kong, kidnapping a lady, climbing up a building. I guess it kinda sorta adds up. So Universal started banging on doors, and many of the licensees caved and started paying them royalties because they couldn't stand the idea of getting their pantsuit off. Only one would push back, that being Nintendo themselves. So in June of 1982, Universal v. Nintendo went to court. Universal's counsel, Townley and Updike, argued that the name and plot of Donkey Kong were too similar to King Kong. However, Nintendo's counsel, defense attorney John Kirby, claimed that King Kong itself was in the public domain, citing an argument made in a previous case by Universal themselves against RKO Radio. In the end, the judge ruled in favor of Nintendo, and an appeal attempt by Universal failed 2 years later. If the name of Nintendo's lawyer sounds familiar, well, now you know how the pink buff ball got his name. So after dealing with Donkey Kong, Mario had him caged to be sent to a zoo or a circus or something, but little did he know, Donkey Kong had a son. Yeah, with the success of the original Donkey Kong, it should come as no surprise that Nintendo wanted to capitalize further. So in August of 1982, a sequel was released, known as Donkey Kong 2 Donkey Kong Jr., known outside of Japan as simply Donkey Kong Jr. This one flipped the script, casting Mario in his only villainous role, and giving protagonist privilege to DK Jr. Similar to the first game, this was a platformer in which Jr. has to evade creatures to reach the key at the top of the stage. But, well, Jr. isn't Mario. As a young gorilla, Jr.'s main means of vertical velocity is climbing up vines. He's faster climbing up 2 vines, but also faster sliding down 1. The first level has Jr. climbing up from the jungle floor, avoiding snap traps and dropping fruit on their heads. You're going to be doing more climbing than jumping here, from the fact that there's more vines than ground. Reach the key, and Mario drags off the cage. Followed by this stage, where you have to push 6 keys up their respective chains to the locks above, while birds swoop down at you and drop eggs, while a couple of snap traps patrol the chains. As each key is inserted, you see the cage come apart. Once the final key is inserted, Jr. busts out his dad, and Mario learns the price of animal abuse. Certainly a better message than anything PETA can come up with. Loop 2 adds this stage where you climb up the treetops to the scaffolds above, while dodging more birds and the eggs they drop. There's a bit more jumping here, as if the big honking spring didn't give you any clue. Loop 3 adds another stage, an electrified hideout where you have to jump over sparks as you climb up. This is honestly where you do most of your jumping. Funny thing, in the international version, Stage 3 actually replaced Stage 2 in the third loop, and it wasn't until Loop 4 that all 4 stages were in the cycle. Regardless, it was clear that Miyamoto and his team understood that a sequel should build on what made the previous game a success, while making it different enough to stand on its own as a game. Now, this was at a time when sequels to games weren't commonplace. As a result, the game was beloved by both arcade-goers and critics. Then came 1983, and what is this? Who got Galaga in my Donkey Kong sequel? Yeah, remember how there were NES series where the second game was a stark departure from the first? Yeah, this came before those, and in this case, it was the third game. Where the first 2 games were distinctly platformers, Donkey Kong 3 was more of a shooter. This was also the only one of the 3 arcade games to not involve Mario in any capacity, swapping him out for this guy named Stanley the Bugman. So I don't know why Donkey Kong would be causing trouble in a greenhouse, rattling beehives and shit. All I know is that I gotta protect those flowers from the bugs and spray the ape in the crotch with pesticide until he's pushed to the top. And that's probably something you could have figured out on your own if the game didn't flat out tell you. So every time you clear a level, you get bonus points based on time and how many flowers you saved. Of course, the bugs are out to get them, and your range is limited. That is, unless you get the super spray that extends your range to the top of the screen. The problem lies in that once it runs out, another one won't appear until your next life. And every time you die... That has to be one of the most gruesome arcade deaths of the era. Honestly, this is probably the weakest of the 3 DK arcade games. While the gameplay is solid, it does get repetitive since the 3 stages that make up a loop look too similar to one another. I mean, look at the first 2 games, where each stage is unique enough to be distinguished from the others. Not to mention, the shift to a shooter style of gameplay is rather jarring. It probably would have been better received if it didn't have the Donkey Kong name on it. It's probably why we didn't get any new Donkey Kong games until 1994, when the original was adapted into a puzzle platformer on the original Game Boy, which also helped show off the Super Game Boy and would later serve as the basis of the Mario vs. Donkey Kong spin-offs, which would gradually go down a completely different path. Then that same year, Donkey Kong himself started off down a path of his own with the SNES classic Donkey Kong Country, which would define the ape's look going forward and give him an identity that separated him from Mario and made him a platforming icon in his own right. Both Mario and Donkey Kong are now icons not only of Nintendo, but gaming as a whole. At this point, it makes me wonder just how the company would look today if that was Popeye rescuing Olive from Bluto rather than Mario saving Pauline from Donkey Kong. My only safe answer to that question is that gaming today would probably look a whole lot different without Donkey Kong. We might not have the same cast of now beloved characters and franchises from Nintendo, and we might actually have a completely different beloved cast of characters to talk about. And about that Popeye arcade game that actually did happen, I might talk about that another month. I'm the Quarter Guy, and until next time, the arcade is closed.
DK!